Now, when most people think about comic books, they think about an escape from our reality. But I want to share with you tonight how they've shaped my worldview. 15 years ago, I moved from St. Louis, Missouri to Eugene, Oregon to pursue a master's degree. Of all the things I was excited to see for the first time, there was one thing I was unprepared for: the overwhelming amount of visible homelessness. I wasn't so sheltered that I'd never seen a homeless person before, but the number of them I found on Oregon streets was staggering. Part of me understood that a mild climate here made it easier for someone without a place to live, but a larger part despaired at the sight of these seemingly unseen people. While all those thoughts were running through my head, I was reading voluminous books in media studies, and there's only so many of those you can take in one sitting. Not long after arriving at the University of Oregon, I discovered there was a comic shop 2 blocks from campus. It was like a homecoming. My interest in comic books started at a very young age with newspaper funny pages, but it will likely come as no surprise that it eventually led to an interest in these 2 gentlemen. When I look back on my life and the various influences that led to a career in journalism, there's no denying that Peter Parker and Clark Kent played a role. Both of them worked at newspapers when they weren't off gallivanting as superheroes, and they seemed to thrive in the thick of the action. Something in that appealed to some part of me. But when I walked into that Eugene comic store, I discovered a slew of books I had no idea existed. I ended up leaving behind the superpowered set and gravitating to comics that exposed me to new points of view and new experiences. I found out much later that this deeply rooted pull had a name: social justice. Now, the term social justice is one of those difficult ideas to get a handle on. We often have our own notions about what it means. But for the duration of this talk, I hope we can agree that an essential part of social justice is understanding the plights of others and developing a sense of empathy with them. My journey to the crossroads of comic books and social justice didn't start out so well, at least not until I found the website Comics with Problems. It was on that website I found this comic called George C. Wallace for the Big Job. Mr. Wallace was a pro-segregation governor of Alabama. This comic was produced during his first campaign for the office, and it's now credited with helping him get there. If you look close in the bottom right-hand corner, that's Wallace himself discussing his stance on segregation and why the good folks of Alabama should be allowed to segregate. This comic prompted a question: why would anyone use comics for this message? Sure, it says something about the way the campaign viewed potential voters and their education level, but there also seemed to be something about the nature of comics that diffused an offensive message. Also on that website, I found this: Dignity and Respect, the Department of Defense's training handbook on the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. There's nothing good to say about this book, but I do want to share with you this page because it's fun to gawk. In it, a young soldier is coming out to one of his superiors. He claims that this awakening happened as a result of discussions with his chaplain, but I don't think that's how he figured it out. Anyway, this comic led to the most important question. These are big, important people with messages quite literally affecting millions of lives for years to come. Why would they choose comics as their vehicle? What makes comics the right vehicle for some of our ideas, our most dangerous ideas? To answer that question, I turned to one of the leading scholars on the medium. 20 years ago, Scott McCloud released a book titled Understanding Comics, and it was the first to delve into how readers engage with comics and identify some of the tools unique to the medium. The first tool, says McCloud, is iconography. Through artistic subtraction, a photo can become a circle, 2 dots, and a line we recognize as a face. Furthermore, we interact with these icons in an interesting way. Icons, says McCloud, become masks for the readers, ones we wear as we confront the conflicts in a story. The voice of the characters becomes a voice in the readers' heads, and we encounter the environments that are provided by an artist as a partner in a unique union. But comics also require something else from the readers. It's called closure. Closure is what happens when we see 2 panels like this and we make a leap of faith. In the first panel, we have one guy with an axe and another running away. And then we cross the gutter, that white space between the 2 panels, and all we have is a cityscape and a screen. Now, we don't see the outcome to this short story, but we certainly feel we know what it will be. The closure experience makes comics engaging in a way that has only been emulated by video games. But even those who don't play video games or read comic books experience closure every day. Closure is the reason when we look at photos like this, we don't see a wall, eggs, clock, or car dashboard. What we generally see are faces. We make that leap because of our ability to infer one thing from another. And comics require similar leaps of time, space, and recognition every time we cross the gutter or turn the page. The end result of all this engagement with icons on a comic book page, McLeod says, is that each character is a window, one that looks back onto our world and helps us see its shape. I would add, it can also help us identify our own place in it. With that in mind, this might be one of my favorite single pages of comics I've ever read, specifically because it epitomizes McLeod's window theory. In it, a young Indian woman and parkour goddess is scaling the London Eye on her way to disarm a bomb. As she climbs, an even younger Indian girl spots her and says, "Daddy, look, Spider-Man is a girl, and she looks just like us." It's almost like permission to see ourselves as capable of amazing things, isn't it? And if that's the case, what else can comics do? By a show of hands, does anyone recognize this guy? Not seeing any. How about now? It's Jeffrey Dahmer from My Friend Dahmer by Durf Backdurf. Backdurf released this memoir almost 2 years ago where he explores what it was like being in Dahmer's orbit during his high school years. Telling the story in comics allows the reader to live a bit in Dahmer's skin. In 2 pages like this, we have Dahmer releasing one of his earliest intended victims into the woods. But Backdurf utilizes the visual language of comics, specifically the ever-widening angle, to emphasize the isolation Dahmer must have felt. He returns to this setup later in the book as Dahmer contemplates taking his first human victim. And I want to take a moment to read it to you. I'm often asked why I never spoke up, why I didn't try to get Dahmer help. You have to remember, this was 1976. You never narked on a classmate. It simply wasn't done. Besides, my friends and I, we were just small-town kids wrapped up in our own lives, and none of us had a hint of what was going on in his head. The better question is, where were the damn adults? In a scene like this, the weight of the words is complemented by the weight of the illustration, and what we get is not only a portrait of a damaged mind, but of someone who had nowhere to turn. So comics can reflect reality, but can they infect it in some meaningful way beyond toys and movies? In the 1980s, writer Alan Moore penned V for Vendetta. The central character V seeks to inspire revolt against the politics and policies of being championed by a politician, not unlike Margaret Thatcher. V is only ever seen in a Guy Fawkes mask. Fawkes himself was a 16th century revolutionary who sought to blow up Parliament in hopes of restoring a Catholic monarch to the British throne. The comic was lauded within the medium when it was released, but it got a wider audience in 2005, when it was adapted into the movie of the same name starring Natalie Portman and Hugo Weaving. 4 years later, the hacktivist group Anonymous adopted the mask as one of their symbols, specifically because it was available in comic shops worldwide for about $6. 2 years later, in 2011, the Occupy protesters adopted it. And this is one of my favorite artifacts from the Occupy movement. It's a bandana that can anonymize you either in part or in full, but those little lines around the edges, those are instructions for what to do if you're ever arrested or tear-gassed. So with this in mind, I'd like to turn our attention to what I believe is one of the most powerful recent examples of social justice in comics. It's called DMZ by Brian Wood and Riccardo Burchielli. Wood started telling this story in 2005 when he took what he saw was happening in post-US invasion Iraq and Afghanistan and transplanted the circumstances to New York's Manhattan Island during a second civil war. Wood fixes his lens at the neighborhoods caught in between the major powers. The people of the DMZ are used to reveal the humanities and inhumanities that continue despite and because of a war surrounding them. There are basically 4 factions in the group: the US government, the Free States Army, the residents of the DMZ, and Trustwell Corporation. If you can imagine Halliburton and Blackwater having an evil profiteering baby, that's Trustwell. Matty Roth is our guide through the world of the DMZ. He ends up stranded there while assisting a veteran reporter, but during the course of the book, he evolves from trust fund kid into a self-sufficient, independent journalist. Wood weaves together the various lives of secondary characters through their contact with Maddie. We get to know the DMZ through his eyes and experience the people through his perspectives, with occasional jumps into side stories featuring secondary characters. One of the first people Maddie encounters is Z. Z was a medical student when the war broke out. She chooses to stay and help where she can. She becomes the city's roving field medic. And through her, we learn about the difficulty of remaining neutral, even when it is a job requirement. Z ends up helping members of the U.S. Army, members of the Free States Army, and even Trustwell employees, all while battling against her inclination to ignore those contributing to the problem. We also meet Tony. Tony was an NYPD officer who watched his wife and children murdered as they tried to flee. Tony falls in with the militia that offers vengeance on one of the participants in the mob. He takes them up on it, and he gets his vengeance, but he decides it isn't enough, and he becomes a suicide bomber. Tony is one of two people in the DMZ set on this path that we meet. While he has an outwardly logical desire for vengeance, the other character's motives result from disenfranchisement. And these two masks allow the readers to see the same outcome through two different windows, both of which are great antidotes to the image of a crazed man or woman acting without cause. If all this is starting to sound a little too abstract, let me bring it home for you. Some of you may recognize Staff Sergeant Robert Bales by his photograph. Others may know his actions. In March 2012, Bales was stationed in Kandahar, Afghanistan. After a night of drinking, according to a military official, he left the base and murdered 16 Afghani civilians. At the time, Bales' family was living in Washington State. The DMZ's Robert Bales is Private First Class Stevens, and Brian Wood was telling Stevens' story in 2008. As you can see, things aren't going particularly well for the young soldier in this panel. Stevens started out as a small-town kid just looking for a place to belong, and he thought he'd found it by enlisting in the Army. He learns out the hard way that everybody he knows back home is a Free State sympathizer. He goes to them excited with his announcement, and they beat him as a traitor. Once deployed in the DMZ, Bales ends up taking part in the worst massacre of the war. He and other soldiers open fire on a group of peaceful protesters, but it's Stevens who's pegged as a patsy. He's detained for the crime and then beaten by superiors until he remembers the correct version of the truth. Eventually, he's found guilty in a military tribunal. However, instead of imprisonment, he's handed back over to the residents of the DMZ, who beat him one last time to death. It's through stories like these that we get a closer, more intimate portrait of what it's like to live or do battle in a war zone. Using the tools that comics provide, Wood and Berchielli put us in the midst of an easily recognizable war-torn city. Over the course of the book, Maddie's actions and reporting changed the course of the war, and he's changed by the people he meets in the DMZ. At best, I believe it's possible that readers of the DMZ can have their hearts and minds changed about their willingness to accept U.S. occupation of foreign lands. This all works because Wood had a dangerous idea, one in a different vein from a pro-segregationist governor or a government trying to teach tolerance to the GLBT community, but dangerous nonetheless, and chose to tell it in comics. So after all this, you may still be asking yourself, what's the point? Comics are shaping our popular culture more with each passing summer blockbuster. They supply big media with an endless stream of toys, t-shirts, and Twitter hashtags, but I know they can be something more. Comics have the power to change the worldview of their readers in ways that still need to be explored. I know this because it happened to me. Back in that Eugene comic shop, I found a book titled Midnight Nation. The story is about the people who fall between the cracks of society. In it, I found this page. It shows a homeless man sliding out of our view, becoming invisible to the world around him. This page showed me the shape of my world and the role I wanted in it. I don't always have $1 to spare when I see someone in need, but I can spare my attention at any time. Because of Midnight Nation, I have a ritual every time I see someone living on the streets. I repeat to myself, I see you. I see you. I see you. My purpose is twofold. Part of it stems from not wanting to forget that we still have a ways to go, but it's also my reminder that there are ways to help. Because of this comic, I've volunteered at our local food banks and seek to draw attention to the issues of homelessness and hunger whenever I can in my work as a journalist. In journalism school, I was taught to be a voice for the voiceless. but it was a comic that taught me how to see the voiceless better than any journalism course I ever took. The thing of it is, I wouldn't have found it if it weren't for these two guys, who taught me two foundational lessons. The first was that power and responsibility go hand in hand. The second was how to live heroically. Thank you.